In the age of mass consumption, nothing in the social sphere is left unaffected. All social gatherings are centered around mass consumption as well as conversation. Now, if we had a society that was focused on production and exalting the creative spirit, we'd be a lot better off. Individuals who actualize their potential as well as feel more accomplished tend to be happier individuals. Those were some words that I had written that I wanted to kind of expand upon today. Now, something I've noticed more recently. This is something I've noticed as I've become more interested in, for lack of a better term, intellectual topics, the things we talk about here on this channel. I've noticed that the social sphere, because it exists in a consumerist society, is tainted with the plague of consumerism. For example, you go to have a conversation with somebody you consider your friend, or even just a stranger, a teacher, maybe your boss, whomever, anybody, an acquaintance. The conversation almost always revolves around consumerism of some kind. What do people always talk about? What's your favorite TV show? What music do you listen to? What sports team do you support? Etc. Now, I mean, there's nothing necessarily or inherently wrong with these conversations. There's nothing wrong with some kinds of consumerism. There's nothing wrong with watching TV shows, liking music, or any of these things. But the problem is that when friendships, relationships of any kind become contingent upon them, that means that these relationships are not deep relationships or worthwhile relationships. And this is something that I've had happen to me when I was a lot younger though. A lot of these relationships are completely superficial and oriented around consumerist objects, so to speak. Now, something also that I'd like to point out is identity. This is also a big problem for white people because we've been so deracinated and stripped away from our identity. We're not allowed to identify with it anymore. We've been forced to identify with subcultures, which are also products that are centered around consumerism. So identity is defined by the kind of content you enjoy. And you'll notice this gets more and more advanced with the internet. There are whole places on Twitter that are dedicated to specific subcultures. Oftentimes music. Perhaps you're into metal music. You can definitely find like a metal scene on, pick your social media platform. The biggest one that a lot of people seem to notice, because they also do seem to be quite loud, are the K-pop people. Yeah, they seem to be quite loud and obnoxious and very fanatic. I almost respect it in a way because it's one of the most fanatical things I've ever seen in my life. You kind of can respect the dedication even though it's a complete disgusting industry in every regard. Oh, and the video games are another good example of these sort of I guess they're called subcultures, but they're solely based off consumerism and nothing else. They're not based off shared ideals. They're not based off any notions of a common destiny or anything like that. So they're lesser things. They're more superficial. They're not as personal and meaningful as many other things you could think of. But people they choose to identify themselves with what they consume. That's a big part of modernity. Furthermore, because relationships and the way you relate to one another has become contingent upon the media that you consume, the relationships as a consequence have become more superficial and less personal, and the human beings in these relationships, right? Because the relationships are about reciprocity and what Hegel would call mutual recognition. But these relationships, they're not about understanding the other person and building each other up. It's two individuals who serve as vessels for consumerism, communicating with one another, sort of reinforcing the consumerist sort of attitude. So for example, two people who are really into, let's say, a video game, they'll talk to each other about the video game for hours on end, and they'll just basically say, whatever, there's tons of things you can say, but basically the form of the conversation is just solely about their enjoyment of this game, and it just reinforces why they like to consume this media, or just things about the media that they consume in general. It doesn't go beyond that. It simply just stays there. And this is, once again, like I say, a product of mass consumerism, which is a problem. Now, because of this, friendships decay because they're not actually held up by anything substantial in any sense whatsoever. They're completely, like I said before, contingent upon what you consume, which doesn't really, it's kind of a stupid thing to be friends with somebody about. Like, oh, you like the same thing I like in regards to art? Cool, that makes us friends now. doesn't really make sense when you think about it, because a real friend is someone who has your best interest in mind, and this is what Aristotle called the highest form of friendship, friendships of virtue. The highest form of friendship is someone you want to be around because being around them makes you a better person, because they themselves try to embody virtue, try and orient their life in a virtuous manner. I'm going to talk in the context of men because that's all I can really speak about, because that's what I am and that's all I really know is this sort of phenomenon from a male perspective. If you look at the friendships between men in the past, the friendships were really about looking out for one another. So and so had this person's back, saved their life, they fought for a common ideal, they fought in a war together, they underwent some sort of hardship together, and then through that they bonded through the difficult times, making each of them a better person. In those times of hardship, those men found out who they really were. They had a spiritual development, and that shared spiritual experience of undergoing hardship together and looking out for one another, defending each other, fighting together to sometimes even to the death, made them friends and made them close, because they shared a common struggle and a common set of ideals. They wanted to create something higher, and they wanted to better themselves, and they did this together. That's what a real friendship is. It's about orienting yourself to something greater and elevating your friends and them elevating you. That's the proper manner in which reciprocity should occur. Now you'll notice here there's no consumerism involved whatsoever. These guys aren't concerned about, common enjoyment in art, which is not wrong, by the way, but like when it's only about that is what I'm saying is where it becomes a problem. These men weren't concerned with these things. They were concerned with uniting together to create the world in the ideal image they wanted it to be, and defending one another and growing together. That's an ideal friendship, but there's no room for that today. There's no opportunity for that to happen. So I don't actually blame people who don't have these friendships. I almost feel bad, because there's such a lack of opportunity for these friendships to even grow in any meaningful sense. In America, this is an extreme sort of issue. At least in Europe, you guys still have some old traditional social gatherings left, but in America, unfortunately, and this is probably why our youth are degenerating so quickly, is simply the fact that there's no social centers, there's no proper fraternal organizations like a Mannerbund. I'm not talking about getting drunk and doing drugs and waking up the next morning on the floor passed out. That's not good. That's completely degenerate and doesn't make you a better person. I'm talking about a bunch of men uniting for something but greater than themselves and fighting for it and looking out for each other, and all of them respectfully wanting to make one another a better person. There's no opportunity for that. I mean, the only like male motivation stuff that's out there is, and I kind of spoke on this in the last video, is we're told to go set up an e-commerce store and, maybe one day we'll be able to buy a Ferrari. Okay, well, who cares about a Ferrari when your country around you is literally decaying and your civilization is completely decaying? So the alternative ways out of the issues of the modern world still fall into the category of those same issues, because you'll notice the alternative for men is still just consumerism. It's still about making a bunch of money and buying a nice car and buying a mansion, and that's like the extent of it. That's the height of it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with making money. You shouldn't want to make money. Money is a tool that can lead to better life conditions, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's not what fulfills you. What fulfills you is community and a sense of purpose. A man with $0 on the street who has a sense of purpose is going to be a lot better off than a man with $1 million who has no sense of purpose. Now, obviously, the man with $1 million is going to, have access to greater material conditions and whatnot, so he'll be better taken care of. But I'm speaking in terms of like your spiritual state. If you have a purpose and you're dedicated to it, you're basically going to be unstoppable. Now, there was somebody who did that, who was homeless in Vienna, and I'm sure you all know who I'm talking about, and he's pretty much living proof of this example, or of exactly what I'm talking about. Now, this kind of ties me into the next sort of topic here. Well, it's related to this, but it is a nice segue. How do we get out of this? Now, there is a way out of it if you don't have access to a fraternal organization, which many of you don't have access to fraternal organizations. And this itself is also can be a problem if you're not a creative person. But the only way to be set free is through the act of labor. But it can't be any labor. It can't be cleaning dishes or waiting tables or shoveling dirt into a hole. Unless you really like that stuff, then by all means, go do it, because someone has to do it. But it has to be labor which means something to you. That's the most important part. And this is also why a lot of jobs just suck. I mean, sitting at a desk all day plugging numbers into an Excel sheet, that's not fulfilling work. It's literally smashing buttons on a keyboard for a company that doesn't give a shit about you, and frankly that you don't even give a shit about, and why should you? It doesn't really mean anything. Is it really even producing anything valuable to anyone else? Not really. Most of the time it's not. A lot of the times if these companies went out of business, nothing of value would be lost. Now that isn't to say that well, it is to say they are basically useless, but they're not that important in an existential sense to the sustainment of society. A lot of the time they're just not. So it has to be labor that's meaningful to you. Now I'll give you a personal example actually. These YouTube videos that I do, it takes a lot of work. For the longer videos that you'll see on this channel, the hour-long videos, the book sort of analyses on elite theory, and if you've been here a while, you'll know what I'm talking about. The longer form videos that I've done on books, those are projects that take 2 months sometimes, because I have to read the book, I have to take notes, then I have to categorize those notes, and then once I categorize those notes, I need to record them into a video, and then my friend has to edit it into a nice video, and then we have to go over what we want for the video, and what we think looks good, and what we think you guys would like. So there's a lot of work that goes into the stuff we produce here, believe it or not, and it's a lot of labor. But you know what? That labor makes me and the people who work with me feel fulfilled, because we understand that this work that we're doing is aiding in supplementing a higher ideal. It's supplementing the things that we believe in and what we want other people like us, who are in a similar sort of, for lack of a better term, ontological thrownness, to speak in Heideggerian terminology. We want them to sort of come to be on the same page as us, specifically young men, young white men. So this work is very meaningful to me and the people who help me. And I'll notice that when I'm not doing this kind of work, when I am simply consuming content, whether it just be like whatever, entertainment, I'll feel horrible, frankly. And I'm not a person who gets depressed, thank God, but I will not feel fulfilled unless I'm producing something like this video right now, or reading some book, to put out there on the internet. If I'm not being productive in any way, I will not feel happy. And I think a lot of people suffer from that. And I think if we reoriented the culture in the right way, we'd be a lot better off. We'd be a lot happier as a civilization if we just reoriented the way we look at things. And this is why, to quote Giovanni Gentile, inactivity is death. Which is to say that when you're not doing things, you're basically just decaying. Growth is only sustained by action and through action. There's a reason. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with this phenomenon. The retiree, the guy who worked 40 years of his life, these are typically working class people. They'll stop working, they'll stay home, they'll sit at home all day, they'll watch TV all day, and then what happens to them? A year or two they're fine, but by the 5th year, and I've seen this with my own eyes, by the way, the 5th year they start to get sick, they get worse, and then they die. Why does this happen? Well, I believe that a large part of it is that they're not using their mind, they're not putting themselves to work. The body is meant to function and do things and create. When you don't do those things, when you just sit there in a mode of stasis, you end up dying, and death is the ultimate mode of stasis. What is a corpse? It's a non-living thing with no movement in it. The organs stop functioning, the brain stops functioning, the nervous system stops functioning. That's the ultimate form of inactivity. But a lesser form of inactivity, of just sitting around doing nothing all day, is also a form of death, because you're not actually producing anything. You're not growing as an individual. You're not contributing to your civilization in any way. And if we all did that, the civilization would die, because there's no dynamism involved anymore. So that's the ultimate meaning of the phrase inactivity is death. When there's inactivity, there's no production. When there's no production, there's death. Because the only way for society and civilization to continue on into the future for the sake of its own posterity is through activity. It's also very reminiscent of that phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it. Typically this refers to your memory and your mental capacities. There's also a physical aspect to this. Actually, this is a very good analogy here because it works perfectly. I'm sure a lot of you guys go to the gym. One day you're in the gym and you're deadlifting, let's just say 350 for 10 reps. Let's say you're going really far with it, and then one day you get a back injury. Okay, well you're out of commission in the gym for a month and a half. Now your back's feeling better, you go back into the gym. What happens? Oh shit, I can't deadlift 350 for 10 anymore. I'm down to 200 pounds. And it's the worst feeling in the world when that happens. You basically feel like a weakling, because you are. And why are you like that? Well, because when you work your muscles, they become weaker. The fact that you only have stronger muscles because you've put them under enough stress for a long period of time to where they've been able to adapt to certain repetitions and certain sets of weight, and you can keep doing that and you'll keep getting stronger because your muscles keep adapting to harder scenarios. But if you don't do that, if you don't sustain not only their adaptation, but you keep pushing them so they grow and they become stronger, well, what happens is you basically get weaker because your muscles are no longer undergoing that stress that is needed for them to basically sustain the load of stress you're putting on it. Not to get into like fitness science here, but you get the point. In order for you to be a strong person, the only way you're going to do that is by putting yourself into situations where you're forced to adapt. Now that applies physically, as I've just explained. That also applies mentally, as I've just explained. A child doesn't start out his life reading The Science of Logic by Hegel. He starts out his life reading what do people do kids even read anymore? I don't know. He starts his life out by reading picture books. Okay, well then eventually he adapts to the ability to read picture books, and then he gets a little bit older and he starts reading something more difficult because he's well adapted to picture books. Now it's easy for him. By the time he's in high school, he's reading Shakespeare. But then, let's say he continues on, he gets into philosophy. Okay, well, by the time he's 18, 19, 20, he's reading The Science of Logic, if he's lucky. But you get the point. The more you adapt, the more you can adapt to harder situations, and the more you can grow. That is itself activity. If you don't do that, if you become inactive, you lose everything worthwhile. I'm going to bring this full circle in a minute. So we have this society of mass consumerism, which is a problem, and the only way out of it is to replace consumerism with what I like to call producerism. Meaning, instead of, hey, what shows can I watch tonight when you come home from work? Say to yourself, hey, what can I create that'll be good and maybe valuable to others, or just valuable to myself? Preferably, it's the best thing to try and make it valuable to everybody else because you want to contribute to society. That's a objectively good thing to do, and that's how society not only advances but sustains itself. We need an attitude of producerism. Like I explained before with the fraternity and manor bun sort of scenario. These social institutions, which we used to have in America, by the way, but they basically fell out of fashion. Roughly the 90s, we lost men's clubs, or like late 80s, early 90s, we started to see a decline in men's clubs and other social institutions. And there's a whole book on it, which I do plan on covering on this channel eventually. It's called Bowling Alone. In this book, this guy talks about the decline of social organizations that exist outside work and school, but that are also not things like bars or seemingly degenerate, not okay. Of course, bars aren't degenerate in the sense that like shooting up heroin in an alley is degenerate, but you're certainly not becoming a better person by having 5 whiskeys at a bar. But you get the point. There's a lack of institutions for specifically men to sort of interact with one another in a positive way where they build each other up. So we need to replace the consumerist mindset with the producerist mindset, which is basically people need to become more creative, create things, because when you create stuff, you begin to be more active, which actually makes you a happier person in my estimation. Now, I know people say you shouldn't strive for happiness because happiness is a fleeting feeling, and that's correct. Actually, it is a fleeting feeling. What you should be striving for is fulfillment and attaining the highest good. One way of doing that, though, is by creating fraternal organizations centered around virtue. However, not everybody is creative. Some people are naturally just not creative people, and that's fine. This is why I believe that class distinction is a good thing, not because I think it's good to rule over and abuse lower classes or anything like that, but because I believe that classes are good because it's nature categorizing different kinds of people based on their potential, which relegate them to certain tasks. And people will say, well, that's good and all, but wouldn't it be best if we had room for these people to kind of grow into higher classes? And to a degree, yes, that is, but that'll kind of happen on its own. But see, we don't live in a meritocracy, and there never has existed a meritocracy. There's always been nepotism and plannings of self-interest involved, which isn't always bad either, by the way. Nepotism can be a good thing sometimes if it's done properly and with a proper moral conscience. So yeah, not everyone's creative, which is fine. Some people are fine with just being consumers, and maybe that's just what they're meant to be. And I was saying, yeah, like it's the reason it's good to have these different classes, because each class serves a role. But in my opinion, a guy sweeping the floor and a guy who's like a poet, two very different people. It's kind of a good thing that the guy sweeping the floor doesn't have the desire or the potential to become a poet. Not because I want to keep these people down, but because if these people were capable of such things, they would not want to sweep floors anymore, because they'd realize that they were meant for greater things, which is completely understandable and completely permissible in my opinion. But if everybody who sweeps floors was like that, nobody would be sweeping floors because they would realize they were made for more. So you do want to have people who are just kind of like destined to sweep floors and whatnot, because if they had the potentials and the ambition, then they wouldn't want to do their job, and rightfully so. You want lower IQ people in your society, actually, to a limited degree, of course, before it gets too out of hand, because they do provide some benefit by sort of just staying in a sphere, in an economic specter that any other ambitious person wouldn't want to fulfill, and only these people, these low ambition people, could fulfill them. So they do provide a purpose because of that. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to be as articulate as possible. But there are uncreative people who aren't dumb, they're just not very ambitious people who do have a problem with consumerism. Now, when I say a problem with consumerism, I don't simply mean they are consumers and therefore have like an addiction, which they probably do. What I mean to say is that they don't like living in a consumerist society because they could feel their soul is draining or whatever. Now, most of these people will be more creative because they'll realize they're meant to do more than sit around and watch TV shows all day, because they feel like when they do that, their potential is being taken away from them. But some people, not necessarily. Some people just don't want to consume content all day because they feel like it's too much for them or whatever. So that they have a problem with consumerism from a perspective of overstimulation, not from a perspective of their potential being depleted. Those are two very different things. So you have two categories of people that I've seen who have a problem with consumerism. Are the people who feel like they're being overstimulated when they consume content, which these people tend to be less creative and maybe lower IQ, which is an insult to them, by the way. I'm just being objective here. And less creative, less ambitious, probably not the smartest either, but they do feel like, well, if I just sit home watching TV shows all day, I can't handle this. I need to go out. I need to do something, because it's just not a way to live life in this lifestyle of consumption. The other kinds of people are higher IQ people who say to themselves, I can't keep consuming content because I'm meant to be making stuff and doing other things. I have more potential, and I'm wasting my potential by sitting here. So those are the two people who have problems with consumerism. The path for this higher IQ individual and the more ambitious person is very clear. You have to work to make yourself free, basically, from that. That's different depending on the person and their interests. For the lower IQ person, which unfortunately not a lot of people cater to, for them, what they need to do to sort of beat this demon, so to speak, of mass consumerism, well, they need to end their overstimulation by not engaging in any overstimulating activities. They need to take the Heideggerian path of just walking in the woods and, maybe go on a hike. Maybe go, feed some animals or whatever. Turn your phone off for a couple hours. For the less ambitious person who just doesn't want to sit around watching TV shows because they feel like they can't do that, and understandably so, they need to detox themselves from consumerism. And that's also another straightforward path. I hope this has been of some use. I know this kind of seemed all over the place, but there are points here that are related to one another. You need fraternity, you need friendship, proper friendship, a friendship of virtue where you guys are building each other up and working in service of a greater ideal that's greater than yourselves. If you're more ambitious and you're smarter, you need to be using that to produce things which are better for society. And if you're not that smart and you're not that ambitious, that's okay as well. You exist for a reason and you're here to serve a purpose. But you need to work on not stimulating yourself with consumerist stuff. Just, for lack of a better term, turn off your whatever.